You think you know the story of Cleopatra, the seductive queen, the asp, the tragic suicide that ended Egypt's pharaonic age. You've been fed a carefully crafted lie for over 2,000 years. What you're about to discover will shatter everything you believe about one of history's most pivotal moments. The official story is neat, clean, digestible. Cleopatra, defeated and desperate, allows an asp to bite her rather than face the humiliation of being paraded through Rome as a prisoner. Case closed. History moves on. But what if I told you that every major historian who recorded this story had a vested interest in perpetuating the lie? What if the woman who supposedly died in that tomb was actually orchestrating one of the most brilliant deceptions in human history? August 30th, 30 BCE. Alexandria has fallen. Octavian's forces control the city. According to every history book, Cleopatra retreats to her mausoleum with two loyal servants, Iris and Charmian. She sends a final letter to Octavian, then dies by snakebite. The servants die alongside her. Octavian arrives to find 3 corpses and declares Egypt officially conquered. But here's where the story starts to unravel. Have you ever wondered why Octavian, who had every reason to display Cleopatra's body as proof of his victory, immediately ordered her sealed in an unmarked tomb? Why did he refuse to let anyone see the body, except for a handful of his most trusted centurions? Why were those same centurions transferred to distant provinces within weeks of the supposed death? The first crack in the official narrative comes from a papyrus fragment discovered in a private collection in Rome. Written in Demotic script, dated to the reign of Augustus, it contains a shipping manifest for vessels departing Alexandria in the weeks after Cleopatra's alleged death. One entry stands out immediately. A merchant vessel bound for Ephesus, carrying what the manifest describes as precious cargo requiring special handling and absolute discretion. The manifest was signed by Marcus Agrippa himself, Octavian's most trusted general. Why would Agrippa personally oversee a merchant vessel unless that cargo was of extraordinary importance? And why Ephesus? This detail is crucial because Ephesus was home to the Temple of Artemis, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. More importantly, it was a sanctuary city. Under ancient law, anyone who reached the temple grounds was granted automatic protection from pursuit. Even Roman legions couldn't touch you there. It was the perfect hiding place for someone the entire Mediterranean world believed to be dead. But shipping records in sanctuary cities are just the beginning. The real evidence lies in following the money. You have to understand, Cleopatra wasn't just a political leader. She was one of the wealthiest individuals in the ancient world. Egypt's grain exports, the legendary treasures of the pharaohs, trade networks spanning from Britain to India. We're talking about resources that could fund entire armies for decades. After her supposed death, something extraordinary happened to Egypt's wealth. Yes, Octavian looted the obvious treasures, the gold from the palaces, the ceremonial artifacts. But the vast majority of Egypt's liquid assets, the gold reserves, the trading partnerships, the network of banks and moneylenders that financed half the Mediterranean economy, those didn't end up in Roman hands. They simply vanished. Here's what's truly shocking. Roman records show Octavian struggling financially within 5 years of conquering Egypt. This makes absolutely no sense if he had truly captured one of the ancient world's greatest fortunes, unless of course that fortune had already been moved beyond his reach. Ancient banking records across former Roman territories reveal a pattern of massive financial transfers in the years immediately following Cleopatra's supposed death. Gold moving from Alexandria to Ephesus, from Ephesus to Antioch, from Antioch to cities along the Silk Road. Someone was systematically relocating Egypt's wealth eastward, far from Roman control. The paper trail leads to Syria, to archives maintained by descendants of ancient merchant families. Buried in these records is a document that changes everything. A letter of credit written in Greek, authorizing the transfer of funds equivalent to modern billions. The signature at the bottom isn't some anonymous merchant or Roman official, it's written in hieroglyphics. The cartouche of Cleopatra's 7, dated 3 years after her supposed death. 3 years. She was alive, active, and moving vast resources across the ancient world while Rome celebrated her demise. But this was just the beginning of a plan that would reshape the balance of power for centuries to come. The real genius of Cleopatra's deception wasn't just faking her death, it was understanding that her greatest threat wasn't Roman armies, but Roman economics. Egypt was the breadbasket of the Mediterranean. Control Egypt's grain exports and you control Rome's ability to feed its people. Lose that control and even the mightiest empire becomes vulnerable to famine and revolt. But here's what Octavian and his advisors never realized. Cleopatra had spent years building secret trade agreements with kingdoms beyond Roman reach. The Parthian Empire, the Kushan dynasty, the Han Chinese. While Rome focused on military conquest, she was creating an economic network that could function independently of Mediterranean trade routes. Evidence of this network appears in the most unexpected places. Silk Road archaeological sites contain Egyptian artifacts that shouldn't exist. Roman historians mention mysterious grain shortages that forced Octavian to seek emergency supplies from sources they refused to identify. Chinese records from the Han dynasty describe diplomatic missions from a Western queen who bore the titles of Pharaoh, missions that occurred years after Cleopatra's official death date. The pieces of this puzzle span continents and centuries, but they all point to the same conclusion. Cleopatra didn't just survive her encounter with Octavian, she orchestrated a systematic transfer of Egypt's wealth and influence to regions beyond Roman control, then spent the rest of her life building the economic foundations for what would eventually become the greatest challenge to Roman dominance. Think about the timing. Within decades of Cleopatra's supposed death, Rome began experiencing unprecedented economic pressures. Trade routes that had been stable for centuries became unreliable. Eastern kingdoms that had been client states began asserting independence. The Parthian Empire, previously content to control the Iranian plateau, suddenly had the resources to challenge Roman expansion. But the most compelling evidence comes from an unexpected source. Early Christian writings, documents that were excluded from the official biblical canon, contain references to a mysterious benefactor who funded the spread of Christianity throughout the Eastern Roman Empire. These texts describe a queen from the land of the Nile who provided gold, safe passage and protection to early Christian communities fleeing Roman persecution. One manuscript, discovered in a monastery near Damascus, describes a meeting between the Apostle Paul and a woman identified only as the last pharaoh. The meeting allegedly took place in Ephesus, at the Temple of Artemis, more than 5 years after Cleopatra's supposed death. The text describes her as still beautiful, still commanding, but changed by her experiences. She speaks of a new kind of power, one that doesn't depend on armies or palaces, but on ideas and faith. According to this account, she told Paul that she had learned something from her defeat by Rome. Military power was temporary, political power was fragile, but spiritual power, the power to change how people think and believe, that was eternal. The manuscript suggests that Cleopatra saw in early Christianity not just a refuge from Roman persecution, but a weapon that could eventually bring down the empire that had destroyed her kingdom. This connection explains something that has puzzled historians for centuries. How did Christianity spread so rapidly through regions that had been hostile to foreign religions? How did a small Jewish sect become the dominant faith of the Eastern Mediterranean in just a few generations? The answer may lie in the resources and network that Cleopatra had built during her years in hiding. But there's more. The early Christian church had access to sophisticated knowledge that shouldn't have existed. Medical texts, engineering manuals, astronomical calculations, agricultural techniques that were supposedly lost when the Library of Alexandria was destroyed. These weren't just preserved by accident. Someone with access to Egypt's accumulated knowledge was systematically sharing it with communities across the ancient world. The implications are staggering. If Cleopatra survived, if she spent decades building an alternative power structure based on economic influence and religious ideology, rather than military might, then the fall of Rome wasn't inevitable historical progression. It was a carefully orchestrated campaign of economic warfare that began in that tomb in Alexandria. Consider the evidence. Roman expansion stalled precisely when it should have accelerated. After conquering Egypt, Octavian had the resources to push further into Africa, deeper into Germania, perhaps even to challenge the Parthians directly. Instead, Rome became increasingly defensive, increasingly dependent on barbarian mercenaries, increasingly vulnerable to economic disruption. The traditional explanation is that Rome grew too large to govern effectively. But what if the real reason was that someone was systematically undermining its economic foundation? What if every trade disruption, every client kingdom that switched allegiances, every mysterious shortage of crucial resources was part of a coordinated strategy? The pattern becomes clear when you map the spread of Christianity against the decline of Roman economic power. Every major Christian center became a hub of trade and learning that operated independently of Roman control. Alexandria, Antioch, Ephesus, Constantinople. These weren't just religious centers, They were the nodes of an economic network that gradually replaced Roman trade routes with alternatives that bypassed Roman taxation and control. And at the center of this network, pulling the strings, was a woman the world believed to be dead. A woman who had turned her greatest defeat into her greatest victory, by understanding that true power in the ancient world wasn't about controlling armies. It was about controlling information, resources, and belief systems. The evidence for this interpretation appears in the most mundane records. Tax collections in eastern provinces consistently fell short of projections. Grain shipments from Egypt became irregular and unpredictable. Trade caravans began avoiding Roman territories in favor of routes through Parthian and Chinese-controlled regions. Small changes, individually insignificant, but collectively devastating to Roman economic stability. But Cleopatra's plan went deeper than simple economic warfare. She understood that to truly defeat Rome, she needed to change the fundamental assumptions about power and governance that held the empire together. Roman power was based on the idea that might makes right, that the strongest deserved to rule, that conquered people should accept their fate and serve their conquerors. Christianity offered a completely different model. The meek shall inherit the earth, the last shall be first. Love your enemies. These weren't just religious platitudes, they were revolutionary political ideas that undermined the very foundation of Roman imperial ideology. And who better to understand the power of alternative ideologies than someone who had watched Rome systematically destroy every aspect of her world? Cleopatra had been raised in the philosophical traditions of Alexandria, trained in the diplomatic arts of the Hellenistic kingdoms, educated in the administrative techniques that had allowed Egypt to prosper for thousands of years. She knew that ideas could be more powerful than armies, given time and proper cultivation. The timeline fits perfectly. Christianity exploded across the eastern Mediterranean just as Roman economic power began its long decline. The early church had access to resources, knowledge, and protection that allowed it to survive and flourish despite official persecution. Christian communities established trade networks, educational institutions, and communication systems that operated independently of Roman control. By the time Rome officially adopted Christianity under Constantine, the religion had already established an alternative power structure that spanned the known world. Constantine didn't convert Rome to Christianity. He recognized that Christianity had already converted the empire's economic and intellectual elite, and he was simply acknowledging the new reality. But here's where the story takes its most shocking turn. If Cleopatra was the hidden architect of this transformation, then her influence didn't end with the fall of Rome. The Christian church preserved and transmitted not just religious teachings, but the accumulated knowledge of the ancient world. Scientific texts, philosophical treatises, engineering manuals, agricultural techniques, all carefully maintained in monasteries and scriptoriums across the former Roman territories. When the Western Roman Empire finally collapsed, this knowledge didn't disappear. It was preserved, studied, and eventually transmitted to the Islamic world during the early centuries of Muslim expansion. Islamic scholars translated and built upon Greek and Egyptian texts that had been preserved by Christian communities. The golden age of Islamic science and mathematics was built on foundations that traced back to the Library of Alexandria. And from the Islamic world, this knowledge eventually made its way back to Western Europe during the Renaissance. The rediscovery of ancient learning that sparked the Renaissance wasn't really a rediscovery at all. It was the return of knowledge that had been carefully preserved and transmitted through networks that ultimately traced back to Cleopatra's hidden influence. Think about the implications. Every major intellectual advance of the last 2,000 years, from the rise of Christianity to the Islamic Golden Age to the European Renaissance, can be traced back to knowledge preservation networks that were established during the decades following Cleopatra's supposed death. The printing press, the scientific revolution, the age of exploration, the Enlightenment, all of these developments were built on intellectual foundations that were laid by someone the world believed had died in an Egyptian tomb. But the most compelling evidence comes from sources that were never meant to be discovered. In 1947, construction workers in Rome uncovered a sealed chamber beneath the ruins of an ancient villa. Inside were dozens of scrolls, perfectly preserved by the dry conditions. Most were routine business documents, but one stood out immediately. It was a letter written in Greek, dated to the final year of Augustus's reign. The letter was addressed to someone identified only as the Hidden Queen, and it contained detailed reports on political developments in Rome, economic conditions in the eastern provinces and the progress of what the author called the Great Work. The letter describes a network of agents operating throughout the Roman world, all reporting to a central authority who remained carefully concealed. It mentions safe houses, secret communication codes, and funding sources that allowed the network to operate independently of official Roman institutions. Most remarkably, it contains specific predictions about future political developments that proved to be remarkably accurate. The author of the letter signs himself as Apollodorus, a name that appears in historical records as Cleopatra's most trusted advisor. Apollodorus was supposedly executed by Octavian shortly after Cleopatra's death, but this letter suggests he not only survived but continued to serve his queen for decades after her supposed demise. The letter provides a glimpse into the scope of Cleopatra's hidden influence. She wasn't just surviving in exile. She was actively working to shape the political and economic future of the Mediterranean world. The letter mentions agents in the Roman Senate, contacts in the Parthian court, and allies among the emerging Christian leadership. But perhaps most significantly, the letter discusses plans for what it calls the final phase. The author describes a time when Roman power would be so weakened by internal divisions and external pressures that the hidden queen could emerge from the shadows and reclaim her throne. Not the throne of Egypt, which had been destroyed, but something far greater. A new kind of empire based on shared beliefs and voluntary cooperation rather than military conquest. This letter changes everything we thought we knew about the transition from the ancient world to the medieval period. It suggests that what historians have seen as natural historical progression was actually the result of careful planning and patient implementation of a centuries-long strategy. The implications extend far beyond ancient history. If Cleopatra survived and spent decades building alternative power structures, then her influence may have shaped the development of Western civilization in ways we're only beginning to understand. The emphasis on individual dignity that became central to Christian theology, the preservation of ancient learning that made the Renaissance possible, the economic networks that eventually connected East and West, all of these developments may trace back to strategies developed by the last pharaoh of Egypt. But the story doesn't end there. Archaeological evidence suggests that Cleopatra's influence may have extended even further than we imagined. Excavations in China have uncovered Roman coins dated to the reign of Augustus, along with Egyptian artifacts that show clear Ptolemaic influence. These finds suggest that Cleopatra's network reached as far as the imperial court in Han China. Chinese historical records from this period mention diplomatic missions from a Western queen who brought gifts of gold and knowledge. These missions allegedly established trade agreements that would eventually become part of the Silk Road network. If these missions were sent by Cleopatra, then she may have been one of the first rulers to envision a truly global economy. The timing is perfect. The Silk Road reached its greatest extent during the centuries following Cleopatra's supposed death. Trade routes that had previously been controlled by various regional powers were gradually integrated into a single network that spanned from Rome to Beijing. Someone with Cleopatra's understanding of international trade and her access to Egypt's accumulated geographical knowledge would have been perfectly positioned to facilitate this integration. But the most profound evidence comes from an unexpected source. Recent genetic studies of ancient Egyptian mummies have revealed something that challenges our understanding of Cleopatra's death. DNA analysis of remains from the Ptolemaic period shows that the royal family maintained distinct genetic markers that can be traced through multiple generations. These markers have been found in mummy remains from sites across the former Roman Empire, all dated to the centuries following Cleopatra's supposed death. The genetic evidence suggests that members of the Ptolemaic dynasty continued to live and reproduce long after the official end of their rule in Egypt. More remarkably, some of these genetic markers appear in the DNA of individuals buried in locations that correspond exactly to the major centers of early Christianity: Alexandria, Antioch, Ephesus, Rome itself. The pattern suggests that Cleopatra's descendants were present at the founding of every major Christian community in the ancient world. This genetic evidence provides physical proof that Cleopatra's bloodline survived the Roman conquest of Egypt. But it also suggests something even more significant. The spread of Christianity wasn't just influenced by Cleopatra's hidden network, it may have been actively guided by her descendants, working across generations to implement the strategy she had developed during her years in hiding. The implications are staggering. If Cleopatra and her descendants were the hidden architects of Christianity's spread, then the religion that became the foundation of Western civilization was actually the culmination of the Egyptian revenge plot that took centuries to reach fruition. The meek didn't inherit the earth by accident. They were strategically positioned to do so by someone who understood that patient planning could accomplish what military force had failed to achieve. But there's one final piece of evidence that brings this entire conspiracy into focus. In 2003, excavations in Ephesus uncovered a tomb complex that had been sealed for nearly 2,000 years. The tomb was located directly beneath the ruins of the Temple of Artemis, in the exact location where ancient records suggested sanctuary seekers would have been housed. Inside the tomb were 3 sarcophagi, each containing the remains of a woman. Carbon dating placed the burials in the 1st century CE, decades after Cleopatra's supposed death in Alexandria. But the most remarkable discovery came from the artifacts buried with these women. One sarcophagus contained a golden serpent bracelet, identical to ones shown in portraits of Cleopatra. Another held a scroll case containing papyrus documents written in multiple languages, including hieroglyphics that matched Cleopatra's known writing style. The third contained a collection of precious stones that included gems known to have come from Egypt's royal treasury. But the most compelling evidence was found in the largest sarcophagus. Carved into the interior wall was a single hieroglyphic inscription. When translated, it read, "The last pharaoh rests here, but her work continues in the hearts of the faithful." DNA analysis of the remains is still ongoing, but preliminary results suggest that at least one of the women buried in this tomb was genetically related to known Ptolemaic rulers. The age of the remains matches what Cleopatra's would have been if she had lived for several decades after her supposed death. This tomb represents the final proof that Cleopatra survived her encounter with Octavian, and spent the rest of her life implementing a plan that would eventually transform the ancient world. She understood that military defeat was temporary, but cultural victory was permanent. By embracing apparent death, she gained the freedom to build something that would outlast any empire. The woman who was supposedly killed by an asp's bite actually died peacefully in her bed, surrounded by the knowledge that her greatest victory was already underway. She had set in motion forces that would bring down the Roman Empire, preserve the wisdom of the ancient world, and lay the foundation for a new kind of civilization based on shared beliefs rather than shared submission. The last pharaoh of Egypt didn't die in that tomb in Alexandria. She was reborn there, transformed from a failed queen into the hidden architect of the future. Her true legacy isn't the romantic tragedy that history remembers, but the patient, brilliant centuries-long campaign that shaped the world we live in today. The asp was just the beginning of the story, not the end. And that story is still being written in every church, every library, every school, every institution that carries forward the knowledge and values that Cleopatra died to preserve. She may have lost her kingdom, but she won something far greater. She won the future. The conspiracy isn't that Cleopatra survived. The conspiracy is that her victory was so complete, so total, that we've forgotten it ever happened. We think we're living in a world shaped by Roman law and Greek philosophy, but we're actually living in a world shaped by Egyptian wisdom and royal revenge. The last pharaoh got the last laugh, and she's been laughing for 2,000 years. The truth has been hiding in plain sight all along. Every cross on every church, every scroll in every library, every law that protects the weak from the strong, all of it traces back to a woman who understood that the most powerful weapon in the world isn't a sword or a legion. It's an idea whose time has come, and sometimes that time takes 2,000 years to arrive.